How wonderful to see everybody today, and so much energy in this room. And I don't know about all of you, but I really haven't been out. And driving here today, I think I forgot how to drive. I also made the left turn, not the right turn. But we'll get there, and we're excited. So wonderful to welcome all of you. I'm Susan Fox. I am the chair of the Westchester County Association. I'm also president of White Plains Hospital. Thank you. It's an honor to be here with all of you in person for my official first event. Before we start this morning, I do just want to take a moment and recognize what we all woke up to in terms of the unfolding events in the world with Russia and the Ukraine. Obviously, we're all thinking about the people in that country, and our thoughts and prayers are with them. So I didn't want to have that unsaid. It's a crazy world that we're living in right now, but I feel like a newscaster back to here, right? They give the bad news, and then we try to move on to hopefully hopeful things right here locally. I'm so looking forward to building on the great work of the WCA. We live in such a vibrant community full of opportunity, and I'm excited about working to grow our partnerships and widening our circle of influence around the county. This morning's breakfast with the county executive has been a WCA tradition for 25 years. It is typically held in January to kick off the year, but as we know, COVID forced us to pivot as Omicron surged in December and into January. Waiting was the right choice. Today, the numbers are low, hospitalizations are down, and the 7-day average positivity rate in Westchester is currently about 2% and dropping each day. That's a good thing. Yeah, that we'll clap to. New York State officials have begun rolling back mask mandates, plus everyone here is vaccinated, which is a great thing. Thank you for all doing your part. While I remain cautious and conservative given what we have seen in these past 2 years, I know we all share the hope that the worst of COVID is behind us and we can get back to normal. It's certainly great to see everybody's full face this morning, at least between your bites of breakfast. We look forward to hearing from our county executive, George Latimer, who is now in his second term. George over here. Congratulations, George, on your re-election. I am sure November seemed so long ago. We appreciate how hard you and your team have worked on behalf of our community, including how you have led us through COVID successfully. I am told the county executive will be sharing some exciting news with us this morning, and we all look forward to hearing from him in a few moments. As we reflect on the past year, the WCA has made great progress despite challenging times. The WCA has been a strong advocate for our businesses and our community throughout the pandemic and continued to create new and engaging programs to keep us educated and informed. You can read about some of the great work accomplished in the WCA's Impact Report. If you didn't get one, please grab one on the way out. The WCA continues to drive the agenda for economic development, focusing on healthcare, workforce development, real estate, digital connectivity, and sustainability. After we hear from the county executive this morning, we will hear from a panel of experts who will be addressing key economic trends. That panel will be moderated by the new dean of the LaPenta School of Business at Iona, Dr. Lynn Richardson. Welcome, Dr. Richardson. Thank you again for all coming out this morning. I look forward to seeing you more often in '22 and in person. It's now my pleasure to welcome and recognize to the podium our leader, Michael Ramita.
Well, thank you, Susan, and thanks everyone else for showing up this morning. I think that weight is like entropy. I don't know about you guys. I've put on a couple of pounds since the pandemic started. We now today are welcoming, I think, 4/5 of the old county executive, who's lost about 35 pounds by his own count. So congratulations, George, on quite an accomplishment. I'm sure George is going to speak a little bit today about infrastructure and the expansion of the economic development programs that Bridget and her staff are working on, including Launch 1000. And as Susan teased out, he's also going to talk a little bit about an exciting new workforce initiative that will give some relief to our healthcare sector, which is a WCA policy priority. A lot of members of George's team are here today. He recognizes them all the time, but I will as well. There's Bridget and Deborah and Ken, and I don't know if I saw Emily, and I think that Andrew was supposed to be here. And by the way, Andrew has a young baby girl, and if you're not a Facebook friend with Andrew, become one, because it's worth all the doom scrolling you have to go through on Facebook just to see those pictures of his baby girl. It's adorable. Also, some members of our Board of Legislature, Catherine Borges here, Nancy Barr, and some others, County Clerk Tim Idoni, and I think that Shelley was planning on coming, but I haven't seen her yet this morning. I want to recognize our sponsors, because without this, there's no this. So the Catalyst, obviously the Office of Economic Development for the county, it's one of our sponsors today. Con Edison, who will be working overtime, I think, starting about 5 o'clock tomorrow evening. And thank you, Jane, for showing up this morning and bringing your team. PKF O'Connor Davies, accountants and advisors, Ron and his team, they do our audits every year, so you know that they can handle difficult, challenging work. PCS Bank, they're a regional institution that comfortably handles both commercial and personal banking. I think I ran into Mary and Charles and some of the other members of the team there. E&T and Allergy Associates, Bob Glazer, thank you this morning. Selznick & Company, a boutique tax and accounting firm here in Westchester. They have handled much of my family's private work for decades. Lori Urbanowitz, Cindy Merritt, and the rest of their team also this morning. Ball Chain Manufacturing, a Westchester-based advanced manufacturing firm that makes, among other things, those iconic U.S. military dog tags that we all know. And also, born in 2020 out of a need to help our local hospitals at the outset of the pandemic, they started the Bonafide mask line that's now the exclusive North American distributor of the KN95 masks that you've all been provided with this morning. And amongst the other organizations that they sell to nationwide are the United States Congress. So that's a great local story born out of the pandemic where opportunity meets success. Finally, this morning, I'll ask Matt Saidman from Mutual of America to come to the podium. They are a full-service retirement services company with a particular focus on nonprofits. And Matt is going to say a few words and introduce our county executive.
Thank you, Michael. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. Great to see you all here. A lot of familiar faces and friends. Love to see that. Speaking on behalf of Mutual America, my team, and myself, we are more than just a proud sponsor of this WCA event. We are a proud WCA member, supporter. We're a proud partner, a proud vendor of the WCA. Best part about that, I think, has been getting to work with these folks, Michael and his team, Amy, Kathy, getting to know these folks firsthand and seeing how much they care deeply about what they do. But I think more importantly, it's that they care deeply about who they do it for, which is us, of course, right? Our friends, our families, our neighbors, our businesses, our colleagues. We really all are better off, more knowledgeable, because these folks at the WCA are working hard for us every single day. And with that, I would like to introduce another gentleman who's working hard on our behalf every single day, County Executive George Latimer.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be with the Westchester County Association again. This is now my 5th visit, and I'm blessed by being here with a fantastic team of professionals that work with me. Michael mentioned their names briefly, but I want to mention their names a little more specifically, have each of them stand and remain standing. All of you, in whatever your field of endeavor is, if you are in a professional practice, if you're in a corporate setting, a large or small corporate setting, if you're in a not-for-profit or religious institution, you understand the same thing that sometimes we don't understand in government. It is never just the public face of the principle that makes an entity successful. Jack Welch stood at the top of a tremendous team of people in General Electric. We know who Jack Welch is, but we don't necessarily know all of the other talented people that made that organization successful. So I watched during my years in corporate life that overlapped some of my years in public life, and I always understood that the single most important thing, if you want to be successful as an executive, is to attract good quality people to work with you. And with that thought in mind, I want to reintroduce people you already know. Please stand, remain standing. The Deputy County Executive of Westchester County, Ken Jenkins. Our Director of Operations, who we stole from you, Joan McDonald. Our Deputy Director of Operations, whom I stole from the state of New York, Emily Saltzman. Our Director of Economic Development, Bridget Gibbons. And Bridget's right hand, I never remember her title exactly, but it's very impressive, Deborah Novick. We have with us our Commissioner of the Department of Planning, Norma Drummond. And our new Deputy Commissioner of the Department of Planning, Blanca Lopez. We have our Director of Administration, Chris Steers. Our Communication Manager, Lisa Reyes, is with us here. You know her from News 12. That's where we stole her from. Let me make sure, did I miss anybody at these tables from my executive team? If I've missed anybody else out there, I apologize. My friends, there isn't a thing that doesn't happen that's good that isn't because of these people. And I lead the round of applause in thanking them for their public service. Thank you. And she's been recognized, but let me re-recognize the Vice Chair of the Board of Legislators, also my friend. She's done a terrific job as a legislator, and now she's taken on a leadership role, along with Catherine Borgia, who's the new chair of the board. But our Vice Chair is with us here today, Nancy Barr. Nancy? And I did not see Catherine Borgia, the chair. Oh, there she is. I'm sorry. Chair of the Board of Legislators, Catherine Borgia. And Catherine has members of her team there, but she's just beyond the eyesight of a 68-year-old man. So, when I had the opportunity to be with you 4 years ago, the first time that I had the chance to present, and I recognize this is a tradition that goes back through Rob Astorino, through Andy Spano, Andy O'Rourke. I recognize that even though I had been around in public office in a number of different contexts as a state senator and assemblyman and so forth, when you become county executive, you're still fundamentally an unknown quality. People don't really know, what is he going to actually do? And I have to be candid. When you're talking to a business organization and you come as a member of the Democratic Party, there's a double question, because the Democratic Party hasn't always been seen as a very pro-business party. I'm not telling you what you don't already know or think. So now you have 4 years to see what it is that this administration has been about. You've had an opportunity and a chance to see the things that we've done. Some things have gone well, some things haven't gone quite as well as we'd hoped for. Some things are still works in progress, as it will be every single day of this particular administration. But I'm always very mindful as a student of history that the world doesn't begin the day you walk in the door, and it doesn't end the day you walk out of this door. I was born in this county, gave away my age 68 years ago, and I was born into a county that was already an impressive, successful county. Westchester County is what it is, not because of the government of Westchester County or the current leadership of Westchester County. It has intrinsic advantages which this association and all of us as business people take advantage of. I've told the story more than once about how my dad, a blue-collar worker who moved from Brooklyn to Westchester after World War II, told me why he moved to Westchester. 2 reasons, son. Number 1, it's near New York City. Number 2, it's not New York City. That is the George Latimer, Bridget Gibbons, Deb Novick Economic Development Plan. We're near New York City. We're not New York City. Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dad. But the reality is that what I have tried to do as county executive is respect the tradition of my predecessors, both Democrat and Republican. And some of those names are lost to history. William Blakely, although his name is on a fabulous law firm here, the actual William Blakely, who served as a judge, also served as county executive. We had another terrific judge who served as county executive, James Hopkins, and Herb Gerlach, who served during the war years. Those three men are put on three of our conference rooms on the 9th floor. I have to remind my people to call the conference rooms by their names, because these were men of accomplishment. The Westchester Community College land was obtained during their tenure. Taking a military airport and turning it into the commercial airport that we know today, which is a major part of our economic development program, came during their days. The great Ed McCalion's name is on our building, and for good reason. In his 16 years, this county grew and thrived in a way that was unprecedented before. It was the major creation of interstate highways in this county, and it was the major U.S. corporations that came to relocate here. Al Del Bello rationalized the Parkway Police, sheriff, public safety function, and helped rationalize the bus system and sent us on the path for the dying Grasslands Hospital to become the thriving Westchester Medical Center. Andy O'Rourke was the man who completely redid the county center. Unfortunately, it's time for us to redo it again. But Andy O'Rourke had the vision to do that, and the vision to take a Quonset hut at the airport and turn it into a more modern terminal. Probably have to do that one again, too. And the work that Andy Spano did as well during his time, the legacy funds. And Rob Astorino, we know we competed against each other. At this very breakfast 2 years ago, when I signed the North 60 arrangements, I credited Rob Astorino for having negotiated those things. We see too much division in politics and too much I take credit against the other person. And right now, when you look at the worldwide issues, this is no time for us to take personal credit. This is no time for us to be divided. We have to find the things that link us in common purpose. And the Democrat that you elected 5 years ago now in the re-election last year does not only have a record of being in this public office as a councilman. Somebody remembered me when I was a councilman in Rise City or a county legislator. But I spent 20 years in corporate life, some of which started out in this county, in this very industry, in the building that we're in now, working for subsidiaries of Nestle and ITT. So every bit as much of what drives our administration is not just my political affiliation nor my philosophical beliefs, but a pragmatic understanding of what moves this county forward, which is to keep in the traditions of my predecessors who understood why we needed a strong and thriving business community, and at the same time, why we needed progressive social policy married together. When you look at the issues like affordable housing and child care, they are not just good social things, they are the most practical-minded economic development strategies we can have. What business amongst you will stay here when housing is no longer affordable and your workforce can't afford it? What business could we attract here if we don't have that? And for those families now in this current society that must have child care in order for both adults to work and productively survive in this society, to put money away for children's education, to put money away for retirement, there has to be adequate child care. So when Catherine Borges, head of the Budget and Appropriations Committee, dealt with our budget, saw our budget additions to child care and says, we can do better, and the Board of Legislators did do that to their credit, and we added money to child care because it is the right thing to do and is the economic right thing to do. We tackled the budget when we walked in the door, and we wanted to stabilize our finances. We had a downgrade in our bond rating. We have now reversed that downgrade and taken ourselves off of watch. We did that by doing what Andy O'Rourke did, which is readjust the way we tax. And when we taxed sales tax at the same level as our neighbors, no higher than Rockland, Putnam, lower still than New York City and Long Island, we generated revenue that allowed us to cut the tax that most people are most affected by, which is the property tax. And 3 consecutive years of cuts in property taxes, the last one a dramatic $7 million reduction in our county property tax levy. And we did it responsibly. We have stopped borrowing to pay for our pension costs. We have stopped borrowing to pay for certiorari reimbursements that come when a business is able to grieve their taxes successfully. We reduced our workforce not by gutting a department, regardless of what their functions were. And many of our commissioners have had to manage departments that were gutted unnecessarily or inappropriately. But we reduced our workforce through a voluntary separation agreement, which had the support of our workforce, our unions, and incentivize people to leave, and then we saved $6 to $10 million. I thank Joan McDonnell for being the author of that particular idea. I get credit for a lot of things that I don't deserve. We renegotiated contracts that were acceptable to vendors like Liberty Lines and Wheelabrator, and in those contract renegotiations, we saved significant money, $20 million over 5 years, $17 million over 10 years. That is not ideological management, that is practical management. And the key of our practical management has been the way we've dealt with the COVID crisis. Because who knew 2 years ago today, when I signed that document, a little earlier in the year, if I recall. But when I signed that document for North 60, and we had a very celebratory moment, who knew that around the corner, what we were seeing in the news in Wuhan, China, would come to New Rochelle, like that. That is why when I watch the national and international news, I always have a certain amount of humility, because things that are happening on the other side of the globe can very easily become something that we have to deal with here. And that's why we started a cybersecurity task force, because what happens when combatants occur is not merely just the missiles in the site, but there's cyber attacks that can happen all across the world. And we have to be ready for it, your organization and our organization. We've tackled our budget, and we hope that we're on a firmer footing as we go forward, so that we can responsibly pay for the kind of capital improvements that we need. Every time you're riding on a bumpy road and you say somebody ought to fix this, if it's a county road, it's us that has to fix it. And not just the infrastructure you see in roads and bridges, but the infrastructure you don't see in our sewer treatment plants and in other structures like that. And that infrastructure improvement represents the underpinning of the quality of life that we have, that we can handle our public health effectively, and that we can handle all of the different things that make us mobile as a society. Our efforts on affordable housing have been very straightforward. This administration, over the last 3 years, has allocated $140 million of capital spending to advance affordable housing. That is not just honoring a lawsuit that we have to satisfy. That is understanding the value of affordable housing and understanding what the county can do to help advance it. And when we work with developers of all sorts, from Bill Balter to Lou Larissa to Ken Carney to whoever it is that's working on the next project, we recognize that we have an economic reason for that affordable housing. And we realize that we need more of it. A report that we impaneled that was delivered a little over 2 years ago showed the need for 11,000 units of new affordable housing. Right now, Blanca Lopez, as she shifted from the responsibilities that she previously had, she takes with her the responsibility of affordable housing into the planning department. And we're working on a fraction of those units, and we've got a lot more to do. But that is part of our strategy as we go forward as well. I know that there's so much more to talk about, and there's really no much more time to talk about. Excuse me for popping my peas there. Let me drop this down. I do think the important thing that we try to understand in this administration is the need for partnerships. The partnerships that we have with the county clerk's office, the district attorney's office, the board of legislators, as separate entities that make decisions in certain areas, but to work closely with them to resolve and solve problems. The partnership with municipal governments. And COVID brought us together, but twice a month we have a conference call with the elected officials, chief elected officials of every municipality in Westchester County. That was not done as a standard routine matter previously. And every week during the school year, we have a morning call, first call of the week on a Monday morning with the superintendents of the 44 school districts. Why? Because people expect us to solve problems, not just worry about our own corporate interest. The corporate interest of Westchester County is defined by what we're mandated to do. It's defined by a $2.2 billion budget and a 4,500-person workforce. But what makes Westchester grow is not just when that county government does what it is required to do by law. It's when that county government sees itself as an agent to work alongside the other governments, the business community, the not-for-profit community, and that's what we're trying to do. I'm happy to announce today, and I want to make sure I get this right so I don't wing it, that we are partnering with the Westchester County Association in your healthcare talent pipeline program. That pipeline program is essential to recruit, train, support, and place up to 100 job seekers with healthcare employers over the next 12 months. This is done through our Westchester Putnam Workforce Development Board. This is an innovative vision of the Westchester County Association, and the county government of Westchester County is proud, Michael, honored, Michael, to be your partner in these efforts. I certainly am willing to take a few questions if you think it's appropriate and as time allows. We have a panel of very articulate individuals who are going to be up here, and they're going to be able to think a little more entertaining than me as I pop my peas. But let me just close my prepared statement for the second. We have to recognize where we are in the cosmos as individuals. I asked the Board of Legislators 2 years ago to consider, and they agreed on a hard term limit for the position of county executive. 2 4-year terms, and that's it. I asked for that, and they approved it as legislation. You may wait a while until you see another politician term limit himself. That doesn't happen every day, but it is the right thing to do. The compensation level for the position of county executive right now makes $160,000 a year. That is less than the county executive of Putnam County and Orange County and Rockland County, and you could make the comparisons if you'd like. In fixing that situation going forward, I intend to fix it not for myself, but for my successor. I expect to have no additional income. Why do I say those things? Because to be successful as a business, to be successful as a government, to be successful as a not-for-profit agency, you've got to get beyond your own needs and see the needs of those that are around you in that world. I was taught on my first day of sales training, people buy for their reasons, not yours. For their reasons, not yours. You need to understand what are the needs, wants, habits, and expectations of the person who might buy your product or service. Does it sound like I went through sales training? That message is with me every single day. When I meet with my executive team, these people whom I respect deeply, whose advice matters so much in the way we make these decisions, I think every day about that. And the single biggest thing that we have to do during this time that's left, 3 years and 10 months, we have to reestablish faith that government can function honorably, effectively, and modestly, so that people see the proper role of government is a partnership with all of the other elements, not a dominant mandate everything function, or not shrink it down to the size of something that you can strangle in a bathtub. Government has a role in the success of the society. It has to know its role, it has to be modest in the way it deals with its role, and it has to be cooperative. It has to be George, not Mr. County Executive. It's got to be us working through this. We need that kind of leadership in government at every level. So here we are, 148 Martine Avenue, Westchester County. I'm honored to have this opportunity, and I hope, as I return the next couple of years before somebody else stands up here as your 10th county executive, that I can do the job as effectively as I can. Because when those days are over and I come back and I join you just as an attendee, I want to be able to talk to you and see you as colleagues and peers, knowing that while I had the opportunity, I did everything I could. Michael, if you have any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Oh, I got a bunch of questions, George, but I want to get questions from the audience if anybody has any. I'm happy to kick this off. I mean, we could have a long dialogue about
I'll leave it up to you.
the need for infrastructure and where that money should be allocated, whether it's the airport or broadband or housing or bridges and roads. But I want to ask about housing. Okay, this has been a big issue at the state level. And the governor floated a couple of bills that were retracted, and you know, you came out on a certain side of those bills, but this problem isn't going away, and there's this tug and pull between the need for affordable housing and home rule and the role of local government. Do you feel that the state has a role to play in affordable housing, and if so, what should be that role?
Well, I think the state has a very important role to play in affordable housing. The problem we have right now in our society is the unwillingness of people to accept how important affordable housing is. that it is, as I just said a few seconds ago, as I assume most of you believe, that it is not merely helping some other people out, that it's part of what we need to have in order to have economic growth, to maintain what we have and to grow businesses to come into town. When we try to mandate it, and that's what I objected to in the proposal, and I'm grateful that the governor has said that she wants to reconsider that, took it out of the budget. We have been strong supporters of affordable housing. Some of the critics of the ADU-TOD bill are critics of affordable housing. They don't want to see spending, and some of them are people running for office, and you create that natural dynamic. Whenever you say apple, I'm running against you, I say banana. But I think, Michael, the right strategies on affordable housing involve the state's financial role and their ability to incentivize municipalities to take on responsibilities to let these things happen, rather than to mandate it. When you mandate it, you generate opposition. It is also a matter of fact that whenever you build any structure, there are environmental realities to that. There's drainage, there's sewerage capacity, there's traffic issues, and those are still legitimate issues that have to be analyzed. So when you try to have a one-size-fits-all policy, particularly from the state down, I think that's the wrong strategy. But the strategies that do work, and the state has done this. Housing and Community Renewal has been a great financial partner to every one of the projects that we've been working on in Westchester County. That what the state has to do, in concert with the county government, is engage with the municipalities in site-specific projects, and also engaging with those market rate projects to take on a greater portion of affordability. Now, for the developer, they will say, I cannot maximize the revenue if I have to have more than a certain percentage of under market rate units. And that is where the state government and the federal government can assist financially to make it possible for more of those units to be affordable. I believe those kind of strategies can effectively work to build more affordable housing, and I think those strategies will be accepted in the main by most individuals in the communities, and that's what we have to strive for. We know that the political structure of Community A versus Community B creates a different climate with which to do these things. But I think we understand that unless, go back to my salesmanship analogy, unless you try to convince people of why you're doing what you know needs to be done, when you just mandate it, you generate a reaction that's negative. And we will never build enough affordable housing until we can avoid creating that automatic reaction to mandating, and we get a greater sense of cooperation. I think we're proving that to some degree in what we're doing in Westchester, and I think we can do better. And I certainly think our friends on Long Island can do better than they're doing. I don't know if I put you to sleep, or what have I done? I apologize. I thought, tried to be entertaining. Sure.
Infrastructure generally.
Yes.
You laid out that it's important to your administration. What priorities, where would you put the pecking order in what our greatest needs are in infrastructure right now in the county?
Well, I mean, there's two realities to the pecking order. The first one is when you deal with, as I think we have in Westchester County, a backlog of projects. We don't have the ability to look on a level playing field and say, given the fact that everything is even today, let us invest this much in roads and bridges, this much in our park system, this much in our sewer infrastructure, this much in our bus system and things like that. We have had a reduced commitment over an extended period of time in capital projects. It was done to reduce the amount of money that you spent in taxes. Unfortunately, you wind up having to catch up the same way you would at your house. If you leave your house without any improvements for 5 years, by the time you say, okay, honey, let's now start to fix the things that are wrong in the house, you're going to have a bigger bill. You're going to have to do a more extensive plumbing fix, a more extensive electrical fix. If you own a home, you know these things to be true. You have to deal with the problem while they're of a certain size. And we had let, and not just Westchester County, many governments, we have let those infrastructure projects grow. So the first unfortunate reality of priority is what has to be fixed, because now it's at the point of being almost unworkable, unusable if we don't make those fixes. And I would have to say in those situations, certainly the integrity of bridges are very high on the list. Paving a bumpy road is important. Fixing a bridge that could collapse. Dams, there are a couple of dams. We don't necessarily own the dams in Westchester County, but that is infrastructure that must be repaired. Lake Isle Dam has been identified as deficient. There's some other ones around the county. Those things have to be addressed at a higher priority. Our sewer treatment, wastewater treatment system is essential. All of them are next to bodies of water that can flood, and you don't want to be connected to the sewer treatment plant that shuts down because it's flooded and is now going to be out of business for a couple of months while the corrections are being made. So some of those priorities are there. The biggest problem I think we have in terms of infrastructure is that for many, many years, the federal government was a major partner in these things. They would pay 90% as a round number of major infrastructure projects, and the local governments could pay a smaller amount that they could afford. They got out of the business of doing that, and so it became a full boat for the town, the city, the village, or the county to tackle a project of great magnitude in terms of cost. That obviously changed in the last year with ARPA, and before that we received Coronavirus Act money, not for capital use to improve our infrastructure, but allowing us to pay for some things with that set of funds that then freed up some of our other resources to do things with. But it is a commitment to spending on capital that sometimes, I alluded to this before, is not always visible. If we pave the road that you ride on, Theodore Friend in Rye, I don't know how many of you live in that section of the county, I live in the city of Rye. Theodore Friend Rye is a county road. It's been in bad condition for a long time. We just repaved it. People see it and they appreciate it. What you don't see is the sewer pipe under the Port Chester's wastewater treatment plant that recently breached and ejected some sewerage into the Long Island Sound that has to be repaired. You look at it and you know we're running around with $6.6 million in arsening to fix something in that sewer treatment plant. We're spending multiples of that at the Yonkers Joint Wastewater Treatment Plant. Those aren't things you see, but those are essential infrastructure. So, Michael, unfortunately, the balance is what is in the most critical need right now that has to be fixed. Glen Island Bridge has to be fixed. No choice. If we want to have access to Glen Island, we've got to fix that bridge, and that is a big-ticket item. And then we look at aspirational projects like I've just mentioned. Both the county center and the county terminal at the airport. Both of those two facilities are not in a condition by which they can be used for their original purpose. When we stop vaccinating and testing at the county center needs a new look at what its purpose would be and a brand new fix to bring it up to the current usage if we're going to hope to use it well. And unfortunately, the terminal at the airport, while it still feels relatively new when you walk into it, it was built prior to the TSA regulations and now flows through an airport. It's completely different under TSA. If you travel, you know that. People want to have services on the other side of the security barrier. You want to get through security because it's a more elaborate process now, and then have your snack bar and whatever else it is on the other side of security. And our airport doesn't structure that way. So those are some capital projects that we have to look at. But in every one of these cases, this is part of a public debate. The Board of Legislators has a role to play in these things. This is not just the administration decides what to do and we do it. And that means public debate. That means you as an individual citizen get input on these decisions. I know that you've got a terrific panel coming up, so I'm going to show us a little self-control here. Thank you for the graciousness of being before you again, and I hope to see you again soon.
Thanks again, George. And thank you again for announcing the Healthcare Talent Pipeline Project. This is exciting stuff, and with matching funds, this will be approaching $1 million towards helping to revitalize our healthcare workforce, a much-needed area and a priority of the WCA. And it represents what the WCA does best: identifying a need, in this case, healthcare workforce, bringing a bunch of different organizations and stakeholders together to come up with solutions, and then acting on those solutions with tangible results that'll lift up the entire community. We have a number of grant partners with us today. I want to recognize the aforementioned ENTA and Allergy Associates. Dr. Miles is here from the Westchester Community College, also Southern Westchester BOCES, nonprofit Westchester, United Hebrew, Open Door Medical, the STEM Alliance, and the Leadership Learning Group. So thanks to all of our partner organizations. Thanks also to George and his team, and a special thanks to Catherine Parker, Nancy Barr, and the rest of the Board of Legislators for helping to find room in the budget to make this happen. We launch in the spring. Now to pivot towards our panel. Last week, the New York Times reported that people are now more concerned about economy and inflation than their personal health from the pandemic. That is a real change. Today, we have economic and banking experts who will share their thoughts and answer your questions. So as I continue, I'll call them up. I know they have to get mic'd up. Of course, everything changed and the world pivoted on its axis last night, so much of what they have to say will be informed by the situation in the Ukraine. Our panel is led by the new dean of the LaPenta School of Business at Iona College, Lynn Richardson. Dean Richardson holds a doctorate in marketing from the University of Alabama and previously served as the dean of the business schools at the University of Mary Washington and Ball State. She has a history of professional and civic volunteerism in every community where she has worked, and she is a marketing and sales expert in study and in practice. And she estimates that as a lifelong Girl Scout, she has sold personally about 1 million boxes of Girl Scout cookies. So Lynn, as we welcome you to the stage, I have 2 words: Thin Mints. Those are my personal favorites. So instead of the frittata next year, maybe just a plate of cookies on the table for everybody.
So I could probably hook you up. I could probably find you some Thin Mints, Michael.
Thank you to you and the panel.
So 1 million might be a little bit of an exaggeration, but probably not much with 20 years of being a scout and a leader, and then just buying my share over the years. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to tell you that what Michael and George have said is that we do have an educated, articulate, fabulous panel. And instead of giving you long bios for each one of them, I'm going to tell you their titles and a fun fact about each one of those, and then we'll get started. So I'll introduce all of them first, and then I'll start peppering them with questions. So Michael Goldrick is the Executive Vice President and Chief Lending Officer of PCSB Bank. And a fun fact about him is that he's a 3rd-generation banker. He and his 2 brothers are the 3rd generation of the banking family. And now he has a son who's a banker. So this is the family business, it sounds like. So that's Michael next to me. We got 2 Michaels, so we're going to be Michael and Mike. So. Shannon Seary is an economist with Wells Fargo Corporate and Investment Bank. And Shannon is engaged. And this past, very recently, she was on a trip to France, and she and her fiance went to the D-Day beaches at Normandy, where her fiance's grandfather landed during World War II. That's pretty cool, right? Shannon. And then Mike Vitale is the Senior Managing Director of Sterling National Bank. And his fun fact is that he has 10-month-old twins, Sean and Isabel. So he has his hands full. He might be a little sleep deprived still even. So Mike, welcome to you as well. So we're going to, as we go through this today, we're going to take it from more of a macro view to a micro view. And yes, with what happened overnight, we may kind of detour, and Shannon might want to talk a little bit more about that than we had planned to. But we'll start with Shannon and ask her to tell us kind of briefly where we are in the recovery and what Wells Fargo expects over the next year. And then you can intersperse Ukraine into this conversation as well. So Shannon.
Thank you, Lynn. So if we think about where the economy is in terms of the recovery and what we're expecting over the course of the year, it's really kind of what we've been seeing over the past 2 years, right? So the same challenges are persisting. Michael mentioned inflation in his introduction. That obviously remains top of mind for consumers, business owners, but it's also supply challenges, whether that's the inputs that we're seeing, lack of those inputs, or labor challenges, as well as geopolitical risk, obviously, with Ukraine happening overnight. So that's an increased risk to the outlook. But as we look forward, the story has changed in terms of policy reaction. So we expect the Fed is going to step in here and remove some of that accommodation, which will, kind of pedal the brakes on growth just a bit in terms of the near term. So we're looking for the Fed to increase rates 125 basis points this year. So that's a considerable amount of tightening in a short period of time. And we expect that first rate hike to come in March. So again, some near-term tightening from the Fed in addition to less stimulus from fiscal authorities really suggests a moderation in growth as we look forward in terms of consumer spending being pulled back, as well as some of that business investment. So we're looking for the U.S. economy to expand at about a 3.5% pace this year, which is still above the natural speed limit of growth, above that potential growth rate, but well below of what we've seen over the last year coming out of the pandemic. So, Ukraine obviously poses another challenge. We're still trying to digest how it exactly affects the outlook. But what I can say is with Russia and Ukraine as such a small portion of total global GDP, if they were to fall into a recession, it's not likely going to bring us a global recession, but it obviously has implications for oil prices, specifically in the European Union, since about 40% of their demand comes from Russia itself. So definitely some implications, and more so, I think, some hit to sentiment measures as the world kind of digests the news.
Okay, thank you. I forgot to mention, at the end of our panel discussion, we'll give you the opportunity for questions as well. So jot down your questions and be ready for that microphone in your face shortly. Okay, so we're going to turn to Michael here. And Shannon just talked a little bit about the inflation situation and the expectation that the Fed's probably going to act this year to remove some accommodations from to help the economy. How have rates been impacted in the first quarter of 2022?
They absolutely, as most of us know in the room, they've been impacted drastically. And if I was here the last 4 years, I would have been sitting up here and I would have been wrong. I would have kept on saying the interest rates are rising, and everyone would have said no. At the beginning of this year, the rates have risen, quite drastically, I believe. And a lot of the things that we price off on the commercial side and then into the residential world, we do off the treasuries. The 5-year Treasury right now is about, well, as of yesterday, was about 1.85. At the end of December, going into January, it was about 1.36. And a year ago, prior January, it was 0.36. So that incremental jump from 0.36 to 1.36 to 1.85 has been, quite drastic. At the same respect, the 10-year Treasury over a year ago was about 0.93, a little bit under 1. That's now up closer to 2. So that big push up in the rates with the Fed announcements that there's going to be more rate hikes has caused a tremendous, somewhat a little bit of a demand on being able to get deals done now before the rates increase further, but definitely hugely impacting what the rates are in the commercial banking world and on the residential side for home mortgage rates, home refinances, et cetera, et cetera.
Thank you. So Mike, we'll turn to you and kind of drive it a little bit closer to home with Westchester County in terms of the development that's going on here. And can you talk to us a little bit about how this is all impacting the community?
Yeah, sure, Lynn, and thank you. It's great to be here. So I think kind of on a local level from, the businesses that I deal with at Webster Bank on kind of a daily basis, we can kind of, it's a little bit of a smaller microcosm of what kind of Shannon said about kind of consumer spending, and that there's definitely some pent up demand, I think, that from the pandemic of people going out and doing things. If you look, everyone's been out to a restaurant recently, things are packed, grocery stores are packed, but people are complaining about inflation and the fact that everything costs more, but they're still spending the money. So obviously when rates go up, that could be an impact in terms of at that point, things maybe become a little less affordable, growth could potentially slow, but we're kind of seeing, for the most part, people are relatively optimistic about the business community kind of going forward. There's we're hearing about shortage in labor. A lot of our clients are spending money. They're not looking to cut expenses, they're looking to spend money. A lot of things are costing more, which again, you hear complaints about, but for the most part, we are seeing that businesses are willing to take that and make that investment. So that's definitely a positive sign. Again, Ukraine, inflation, interest rates, that's all potentially pitfalls to that, but the business community right now feels, it feels strong from the things that we're kind of hearing on a local level. So certainly a positive, but there are a lot of things out there as we've kind of all talked about so far.
So back to you, Michael. What kind of impact on liquidity has the support this last year had?
That's definitely, it's exactly connected to the process. The CARES Act pumped a couple $100 billion into the system. It was inevitable that would cause inflation, which then generally leads to interest rate rises, increases to temper that inflation a little bit. So we've been dealing with that. The biggest part was for the last 2 years we were dealing with, with the recovery, with the pandemic. It's hard to predict. No one would have, I know, as we go through, the total risk assessment year by year, you're always looking at different things and whether or not it's going to be a weather-related incident or some other type of economic incident. In my estimation, pandemic was never high on my list. Now it is high on the list. The other part of it too, and before, and I guess I was going to say no one could have predicted, but with Russia maybe you can. You wouldn't predict the war being high on that list, but those things are now high on the list. So the liquidity that was infused into the system was done obviously to offset some of the impact from COVID. It did its correct job, but unfortunately after that, comes inflation. The other aspect of the liquidity, and from the banking world, the liquidity that we have on our books, we have to put to work. It's the same thing for the investor groups. They want to put that money out there, so that's driving inflation, it's driving price increases. The same as with anyone with a 1031 exchange that they're looking to do today. It's hard to find something in our backyard. We have customers that are going into states and new horizons to find that proper investment and get that proper return. So it's kind of a domino effect. It's impacted. It's all related. But the liquidity in the system is still there. The banks have it. The investor group have it. And we're looking for the proper asset class to put that liquidity to work.
So Shannon, you mentioned briefly in your opening remarks something about the overall consumer. Can you tell us a little bit about what Wells Fargo thinks the state of the consumer is today?
Sure. So I'm kind of echoing Michael's comments about the liquidity profile. So the fiscal support that we've seen was really unprecedented, if I can use that word, right? So it accounted for about 20% of GDP, right, over the last 2 years versus 5 to 10% over the last cycle. So a dramatic inflow of cash really helped boost the consumer profile. And even as that has ceased, so at the end of last year, with the expiration of the enhanced child tax credit, that was the last flow that we really saw hitting consumer balance sheets. So since that has now stopped, consumers are still in relatively decent financial shape. So if you look at balance sheet statistics, their balance sheets are much better across the income spectrum, since pre-pandemic levels. So many households are in decent shape even with that support or that flow of stimulus having ceased. So that means they've increased their savings. Some of that stimulus payment maybe made its way into retirement accounts or brokerage accounts, perhaps funding a home purchase. So this really leaves consumers in decent financial position to continue to consume despite rising prices. So obviously inflation is top of mind for consumers. Inflation, the annual rate is at about a 40-year high, with the median age in the US is at 38. So this is the highest inflation for many households, right, about half of households. So that obviously has some implications for consumer psyche going forward, and we think that can weigh on spending or perhaps cause some tough decision making in terms of how consumers are going to purchase. But we really think consumer spending is going to hold up this year. So we're looking for above potential, above trend growth through this year for spending. And what I will say is we think the profile is going to shift. So throughout the pandemic, a lot of the spending has been directed towards good purchases, as Mike mentioned earlier, in terms of these consumer habits shifting. But, and if you think about that, in terms of the last 2 years, we saw the same amount of good spending that we saw in a decade during the last cycle. So an ample amount of spending in the last 2 years in terms of goods. And now as inflation has really picked up in those good sectors, we think that spending is going to shift back to services as the pandemic has subsided and people can again go out to restaurants and go back to these in-person activities. So a little bit of a moderation in spending, but more of a shift underneath the headline is what we're expecting.
I think your comment about, young people don't really understand inflation. They haven't lived through it. I have adult children and they're freaking out, right? What is this? And because, those of us who have gray hair or maybe no hair, we know all about back in the 70s and, whatever. All right, so let's go back to Mike. Yeah, well, it's true. So talk a little bit about Westchester County. What are you guys seeing in consumer spending and general overall economic activity in the last 3 to 6 months?
So kind of, I'm not going to touch too much more on the consumer spending, as Shannon covered it way better than I could, of course. But just to pivot a little bit onto what you were saying about adding liquidity to the system. We saw a lot of borrowers that had difficulty during the COVID-19 pandemic, and a lot of that stimulus money really did kind of get them through. So balance sheets for clients are looking relatively healthy. The downside, of course, is now that there's too much liquidity in the system, right? So guys like Mike and I, we have too many deposits in our bank. We have too much liquidity, which needs to be deployed, obviously, to get a return. So that's kind of the downside to it. But we are seeing most businesses that are in a relatively healthy state in terms of a kind of a balance sheet standpoint. P&L is a little bit of a different story depending on kind of what industry you're in. Getting a return in your business could be challenging depending on where you are. But balance sheets are relatively healthy because the system, infused a bunch of cash, which went to PPP loans and other types of grants, was actually, sitting now on most people's balance sheets. A lot of times that was offsetting expenses, but in some cases that was actually really a net cash that you're kind of holding, for almost a rainy day fund in some cases. And that cash is still really there and deployed and is capital sitting in businesses. So that's certainly a positive. The downside of that is, of course, that there's too much liquidity in the system, which creates inflation and creates rising interest rates, which is what we're kind of talking about. So it's a little bit cyclical, but overall, that's probably a good thing considering it kind of stabilized the economy. Now we're just kind of dealing with the repercussions of that 2 years later.
So let's go back to Shannon and talk about supply chains, some of our favorite topics, right? We've all probably been impacted by challenging supply chains in the last couple of years. Talk to us a little bit about supply chains and the bottlenecks and where we see that going.
Sure. So if anybody tells you they know when these supply issues are going to last, they're lying, right? So nobody knows exactly when these things are going to end. So I'm not going to tell you an exact date or anything that even remotely gives the impression that I know when this is going to normalize. But at Wells Fargo, we developed this dashboard. It's public, so if anybody is interested, I'm happy to send it over. And we update it weekly, and it basically has a bunch of high-frequency data that we track to try and gauge when these issues are beginning to ease. And we have seen some easing in terms of inventories being replenished a bit, but everything we really look at suggests that things are still really out of whack. So the amount of ships off of the West Coast, the fact that people who don't even follow the economy know that's happening, I think speaks to just how broad these pressures are. But the amount of ships, the shipping rates being up, 50 times normal levels, the amount of volume moving through the system, everything you look at just suggests that supply chains are completely out of whack, and I probably don't have to tell you all that, you already know that. But going forward, looking at where we are today, things aren't worsening, but they're still bad, and we think that they're going to continue to improve over the course of the year, but they're likely not going to normalize this year. So that suggests that supply is going to remain an issue and continue to feed into higher prices and add to that inflationary profile that we're experiencing even as the Fed removes accommodation. So supply is likely to remain out of whack. We do expect labor supply to come back a little bit quicker, so we can get into more detail on that if we want, but in terms of the missing labor force, it really is tied to women in their prime age working years, as we've heard already this morning, with childcare burdens throughout the pandemic really impacting women in particular, as well as your older workforce. So 65 plus, the pandemic, given that it wasn't a balance sheet recession, really encouraged early retirements, has actually led many of those workers out of the labor force. So as some of those workers come back, that should help ease some of the labor side of the supply issue.
Makes sense. All of that makes sense. So we'll go back to Mike in terms of kind of more locally, what impact this has had, the supply chain issues have had in Westchester County.
Yeah, so my bank does a lot of business with people in the contracting field, and we do a lot of lending on construction projects. So those are two areas, or really the same area, that are highly impacted by that. And try to get a 2x4, these days it's you're going to wait weeks. The prices of raw materials has skyrocketed. The time frame to get them has extensively lengthened. If anybody's done a kitchen remodeling recently, it took you probably 4 or 5 times longer to get your fridge and stove than it had, previously. So those are all related to that. A lot of that is being priced in. The price of steel, we do business with a steel contractor that, a lot of times he prefabricates the steel and then installs it. That's a 5-6 week process. You can't lock prices in anywhere near that at this point. So the price of steel could literally double in 4 or 5 weeks. That's an extreme example. That's not really across the board, but just to kind of give you an idea of the price volatility, you can't really price that into a contract, right? So you're a little bit, if you're the client, you're a little bit taking, you're taking the price volatility in some cases, and that's a big risk. So how is that going to impact stuff in the future? I mean, that certainly could impact your price, the price that a contractor would give to a development project going forward. So there's an impact to that. We have seen that kind of level off a little bit. Instead of going like this, prices are more kind of going like that. They're up, but at least they're steadily up, which is a little bit more easier to figure out. But the supply chain issues in that field have really been across the board, very, very difficult for people in those. That's just one industry, but have been very difficult to kind of deal with. So, I mean, look, the business community will figure it out. They always kind of do. But there is some significant volatility in some of those areas.
So just audience participation. How many of you have been impacted by supply chain issues trying to buy something kind of major in your life? Raise your hand. Not everybody, but probably about a fourth of you. Yeah, okay.
Can I jump on that one?
Sure, absolutely.
So, and I agree with Michael on that, and definitely for the contractors and developers. And there was even an article out earlier this week, and we've seen it where some of the contractors and developers are now stockpiling goods. So they're pre-buying, pre-stockpiling the goods that they need, which is also creating a need for space and a need for storage facilities. So that's on the positive side. The part that we're seeing, and I know Michael and I were talking about earlier, some of the other bankers in the room, and some of the things that we're experiencing now with the supply chain are the ability to get closings done in a timely fashion. With the interest rates rising, everyone wants to get the closings done yesterday. We can, of course, do that, but we don't know where the process is going to be broken. The appraisals are taking longer today. The title work's taking longer. The municipal searches. So all that is impacting timing of the closings and predictability. For the appraisal companies, some of it is workforce and labor related. Some of it is the demand. So we never know where the system is going to have a little bit of a crack or a little bit of a breakdown. So we're constantly monitoring that. So the timing of closings is a big issue for us. And it's whether or not it's on the residential side or on the commercial side. So it's one of the things that we're trying to stay on top of, be proactive in monitoring that system and getting it done and working together with all parts, the attorneys, the title company, the borrower, and getting from point A to point B as quick as possible.
See how everything is so intertwined? It's just so amazing. So this question's for any of you. Talk to us a little bit about the impact of climate control regulations and initiatives on all of this. Michael, you want to start?
I'll start, and then
keep
we'll
talking,
go
Mike.
from there. So,
Keep talking.
Well, we'll keep on going. The climate control issue, and it's from the regulatory side of it, it's definitely something that the banks are going to have to deal with. We already have. So on that end of it, it impacts our day-to-day on the compliance side of things and on the credit analytics. We do have to identify any industries or any businesses that may be impacted by climate control. We're in a little bit of a different region where I don't think we're basically too concentrated on any type of levels with any climate control businesses per se. However, we have seen and we have done some solar projects recently. So that's a great opportunity. It's for one client in particular, he had a building that's the size of a football field or two, and put some solar panels up on top of it. And it was a great project, and happy to be a part of that. So that's part of the business opportunity that's coming out of that. But from a bank and a regulatory side of it, there again, it hunkers us down a little bit on the compliance issues, a little bit on the reporting, the concentrations, and the things that we have to look at. I guess for certain banks, whether or not you're in Texas, and depending upon the oil industry and some other things, we're not. We're local. We're all here in our backyard in the related territories. So we don't have as many, I think, direct issues, but we do have some policy issues that we have to address, and it all comes into, the people resources, the compliance, and monitoring our portfolio.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't want to be a banker in Pennsylvania, lending on fracking and things like that. I mean, thankfully, Mike and I don't have to deal with that kind of locally. I mean, a lot of those type of large-scale energy issues are really not for us to kind of deal with. In terms of how we're seeing, it's really more, at least what I'm seeing, is more on the kind of development side. There are a lot of kind of new small regulations that are kind of being stepped up over time when you put up a new building, how you have to have it energy efficient, things like that, which are, it's all positive type stuff. I think, for example, I think by the year, I think it's 2026, I could be, don't take this to the bank, but there is going to be, if you're providing parking in a facility, you have to have a certain amount of spots allocated for electric vehicles, like stuff like that, solar panels like Mike mentioned. So we're seeing kind of small impacts like that. I've had a couple developers put cogen facilities in where you can basically, kind of create your own power. It's a very energy efficient way to heat the building. You can even put power back to the grid, things like that, the kind of small things on the development side that have been beneficial. A lot of those things are going to slowly step up over time from a regulatory standpoint of how you have to develop new products, which is, it's a good thing for the overall economy. Regulation, I mean, we're lucky being up here. I mean, we don't have to deal with, lending on certain energies that may soon kind of be seen as not the area you want to go. So we don't have that direct impact, but it's really more on the kind of smaller stuff that we can kind of do to help out the community from an energy standpoint.
Sure. Yeah.
If I may, there's also a longer term impact that we're looking at, and not only with rental buildings and apartments, and building in or any commercial building, bringing in that reserve for future climate control impact, and maybe adjusting your utilities or your heating system. But we're also seeing it within a lot of us in the room, possibly on boards of condominium or co-op associations. So any condominium association or co-op association that we're looking at, we're being very careful to look at those financial statements and analyze their reserves and analyze their future reserves, and they're planning for that. Some of the associations that we've seen, they want to keep maintenance as low as possible, and they don't have those reserves. So that conversation has to happen, and you have to be prudent in looking at that. And the climate control aspect is going to be a big part of that, and making sure that the availability of resources to either improve the building, make future improvements, renovations, are going to be there. So that's a definite thing to keep an eye out. It's an opportunity for the building community and for the improvement part of it, but it's also important for anyone that is involved on a condo or co-op board.
Sure. Macro view, any?
Yeah, the only thing I can add from a macro perspective is I think, this presents an opportunity for the country more broadly, right? I don't focus on Westchester County per se, but I think that it presents an opportunity for business investment, for companies to kind of, take advantage of that unique area that's developing across the world, really. And I think consumer preferences have really shifted. So you mentioned the electric vehicles, the solar panels. I think that's only going to increase over time, right? Even if it's motivated for different reasons. So I think that it's an opportunity, and we'll see kind of how it develops as policy initiatives also take place in the space.
So I'm watching the clock. I'm supposed to do that. And it looks like we have about 10 minutes maybe for questions from the audience. And so Melissa, here's Melissa, yeah. So she's got the microphone. She's going to get that. If you have a question for one of our panelists, if you would raise your hand and we'll come to you. If you'll wait till they get to you, because we cannot hear very well, from the back of the room. And we'll ask you to say the question if you want to direct it to a particular panelist based on something they said. So we've got one up here. While they're coming, I'm going to do a little commercial for Iona College and the La Pinta School of Business. We have labor force. We have graduates coming out in May. If you need students for internships this summer or beyond, or people who to fill your permanent jobs, please reach out to us. We would love to talk to you about connecting you with our wonderful students. So yes, ma'am.
Well, hello, I'm Belinda Miles, and happy to welcome you to the academic community here in Westchester County.
Thank you.
And thank you for that comment about labor force. My question ties into that as I think about the impact of the pandemic having so many women removed from the labor force, coupled with the census data that tells us that there is a growth in historically underrepresented individuals in this county, I just wonder if the panel can comment on the presence of women and minorities in the emerging economy and what kinds of investments might help them to have a sustainable start to some career development or business development.
Who wants that? Shannon, jump on it. She looks like she wants to talk.
So I'll kind of go back to my previous comment. So in terms of looking at who's actually missing from the labor force for the nation as a whole, it's really women in their prime age, so that's 25 to 54-year-olds, and those 65 and older. So the women dynamic has a lot to do with the child care burdens, elderly care burdens throughout the pandemic, taking care of parents, relatives, children. So as it has subsided, and we have seen some women return, but not nearly all of them. But if you look pre-pandemic in terms of the participation between prime age women and men, women were actually outpacing men. Their participation was way below that of men, but they were outpacing them in terms of their growth rates. So we are encouraged that that trend will persist as some of these burdens continue to subside, even though children are back at school. If they catch COVID, that means somebody has to stay home, and since women generally tend to make less than men still, even not in the same career, whatever it is, they're most likely to stay home, right, and take care of the child. So there's still a lot of those burdens, if you will, that are unfolding even as the pandemic has subsided. So we're encouraged that those workers will return to the labor force. And the elderly, the 65 and older retirement age part of the labor force, we actually think will come back. So while that's more of a stickier exit in terms of once you retire, you're normally out of the labor force for good, we actually think that since prices are so high today, that actually might bring some of those workers back into the labor force, which is encouraging for the broader labor market. Now, in terms of minority groups, we actually did some research on this more recently during Black History Month at Wells Fargo, and we saw very encouraging signs in terms of Black women's participation specifically. So they actually outpace women overall in the country in terms of their participation, and again, we think that trend's going to be accelerated throughout the pandemic, and we've actually seen some encouraging statistics that suggest that to be the case, which is pretty encouraging for the country.
Yeah, just to kind of touch on a couple things. I mean, myself personally, I can even speak to the fact that, you know, as we heard before, I have, 10-month-old twins. My wife went from working full-time to working part-time, and she's a physical therapist, so it's a lot easier. It's an easier job to do that in. She, eventually is going to go back full-time. But I will tell you that the price of childcare is so astronomically high that it almost doesn't even make sense in some cases. So, that was talked about before, but that's a huge, that's probably the number one factor. And again, I didn't really even experience this until, a year or two ago. So that's something that certainly is contributing to it. To touch on your other question, this is just my own personal kind of view on getting underrepresented communities, more in our field of banking, which is obviously, as everybody probably realizes, is male and white male dominated. I think that starts kind of at a younger age, and in terms of getting people into that field that are coming out of college. That's, to me, is how that's best represented. So going out to to college and making sure we hire people that are underrepresented in that field, that would be my strategy for solving it. Not that I have decision-making power at this point on that, but to me, that's how you solve that issue.
It's very interesting. As Michael mentioned, I have been dean at several other business schools, and unlike the other business schools, Iona's male-female business major gender breakdown is quite different. So we are 68% male in the business school. And I kind of figured that out when I first got here because, when school started, because I would look out my window. My office looks out over into our atrium of our new La Pinta School of Business building, and I would see mostly males. And I just thought, well, the guys are hanging out, right? And the women must go somewhere. But it's not. It's mostly men in our business school. So we have some work to do to get women to major in business, evidently in this local area. And then in the finance area, it's even more exacerbated. So, we will have underrepresented population males perhaps going into finance, but we're not seeing the women there at this point at all. So it's kind of an interesting model. So I think you had a question. I see the microphone now. I couldn't see it because of the lights. You're in a halo. There's a halo above your head.
Because I'm an angel.
Yeah, you are. You're an angel. Yeah.
My name is Denise Matthews Sarah, and my question it's a macro question, and then I do have a question specifically for Shannon. First, my question to Shannon. I believe you mentioned about how there's more of a balance sheet now for individuals as far as spending is concerned. Is there a socioeconomic cutoff as far as that is concerned? Like, do you see more, what income level is benefiting from that versus another level?
Sure. So it's across income cohorts. So we have balance sheet net worth data by income quintile, and they're all ahead of where they were pre-pandemic. We've actually seen the largest increase in the lower middle income cohort, so not your lowest, right? So the stimulus checks and the unemployment benefits really helped those households get by, but that middle income cohort actually helped them get by and then also padded their balance sheet. The higher income cohorts didn't benefit from the stimulus, right? The cutoff for that was, I think, $100,000. $100,000 annual salary. I could double check that. So they didn't benefit from that, but they've benefited from a rise in stock prices, home values. But it's really been across income cohort, which is something that quite surprised us when we looked at the data, but I think is more broadly encouraging when you think of the whole consumer profile going forward in terms of where the spending can come from.
Ms. Richardson mentioned that everything is so interrelated. So I wanted to know, based on historical things that have happened in the past, we were currently on this trajectory where, inflation is rising, the interest rate is now going to be increasing, et cetera. But now that we do throw Russia and Ukraine in, et cetera, I know, Shannon, you originally said that, there's no way to know at this point, like, where it's going to go, but do we have, like, any historical perspective as to what one might think is going to happen, as far as inflation and interest rates and supply chain and all these other things that are interrelated? Thank you.
She's asking about your crystal balls. All right, so who?
I'll go again. So, as I would have been wrong with the last 4 years saying interest rates are rising. So, the short-term impact of the Russia-Ukraine situation is definitely, and already the money. I was looking at my iPhone before I came up here, and already the impact of the money over to back to U.S. for safety is going to drive the rates down. So, I think that's going to be temporary. The eventual inflation and temperament by rate hikes will probably balance things out as the dust settles. But so I do envision that there will be those that constant back to rate hikes. I think Jamie Dimon was saying that there was going to be 5 or 7. So maybe the conflict tempers that back a little bit to 2 or 3 as opposed to 5 to 7.
Yeah, so I can add on that. In terms of a historical perspective, the Fed, right, monetary authorities normally looks through shocks to oil prices, right? So this would be considered a shock at this point, right? We don't know how long the conflict's going to last, particularly since it's hitting Russia, which the supply of oil is most significant in Europe, not really the U.S. It's again a shock to the U.S. It's considered a shock. So. The Fed would normally look through that, perhaps wouldn't hike rates, right, err on the side of caution, less tightening in the near term. We expect in March a 25 basis point hike. So in less than a month's time, the Fed's going to raise rates by 25 basis points. There was some talk about that perhaps being 50 basis points. I think today's development kind of lessens that argument, right? So it'll be a smaller hike. But in terms of more broadly what this means for inflation, even though it's affecting Europe more, I think it does have an impact on U.S. oil prices. We've seen that in terms of where prices have moved this morning. And in terms of our outlook at Wells Fargo for the overall inflation trajectory, we saw the annual rates of inflation peaking here in the first quarter. So we did expect inflation was going to slow over the course of the year, though remain above the Fed's threshold of 2%, which is why we have considerable tightening in the forecast from the Fed. But I think the rise in the energy prices kind of keeps the heat on inflation a little bit longer. So maybe we're at these peak growth rates into the beginning of the second quarter before we really see some of that inflation pressure begin to subside, although although still remaining hot by historical standards, or at least the last expansion. Anything?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have too much to add beyond
Okay,
that,
well,
but I would say that, you know, whatever you think is going to happen is probably going to end up not being the case. You know, I mean, there's always, whenever there's a large impact to something, the impacts are going to go. I mean, there's the obvious ones, but I mean, who would have thought that, you know, because of a pandemic, 2 years later, you're going to be dealing with people being in the office 2 to 3 days a week, and I mean, this is the first time I put on a tie in 6 months. You know, like that type of a thing. Like, it's going to be an impact you're not really going to think of. So.
Yeah, we could talk about the impact on the clothing industry, right? Sweatpants were hot there for about 1.5 years, and now you got to kind of dress up again. All right, anybody else have a question from the audience?
And
Yeah.
Lynn, if I'd like to go back to that first question too.
Sure.
So, you know, a great question about women in the workforce, diversity, and what have you. And I think from a context of being a smaller local bank, that, you know, that question is huge and on our plate every day. We do have, as part of our senior management team, a chief diversity officer. So, you know, definitely, you know, someone that is looking over policies and procedures. On our board level, we try to be as diversified as possible, and then that leads into what we're doing on a community reinvestment policy. So everything that we're trying to do is we're trying to reinvest back into the community and all segments, and whether or not it's, you know, the affordable housing, whether or not it's a small business initiative, all of those, you know, hit the topics. And as, you know, as a smaller local bank, you're able to, you know, control that a little bit better. I know you know, the large banks do it well, a little bit more on a macro level, but definitely being, you know, in that size, you know, it's a huge part of it. Ironically, on the women's side of it, I think from our total population of employees, we probably have more women than men.
But at the lower levels.
Or at the branch level and the
Yeah.
retail level, so in a different aspect. So, you know, as Dr. Richardson said, it's, you know, the part of it is, you know, getting those, you know, getting the talent out of the universities that are, you know, that want to be a commercial lender or want to be a CFO or something on that part of it. So it's all that part of the directive, and I'm not even so sure it's you know, it's the millennials and where they want to be. So a lot of our workforce on the senior end is even on the older edge of the age segment. So getting the millennials focused on traditional commercial lending is kind of, you know, it's a little bit of a different aspect.
Well, and I would share that we're actually going to have a program at Iona in about a month called Career Chats. We've done this at previous institutions. You know, I tell students, and I've talked to faculty here about, the students don't know what they don't know, right? They don't know what a commercial lender is. If you went up to the average student in any institution in America, a business major, and say, what does a commercial lender do? And they're going to maybe stammer out something, right? But they don't really know. So what we're going to do is bring alums back, and boy, this is a win for Lynn Richardson. I got the faculty to give up their undergraduate classes on a 2-day period. We've got 70 undergraduate classes, and I'm going to put a business graduate from Iona College in each of those classes to talk about their career path. Because one of the things I learned very early as a dean is that if I put somebody who's 65 years old, who's the top of their industry, in a class with 20-year-olds, there's a little bit of a disconnect. Not so, I mean, I want our 20-year-olds to see this very successful 65-year-old or, you know, 50-year-old or whatever alum, but I also want the students to see 30-year-old alums who are doing well, right? So we're putting these folks in classes, but the 65-year-old, we're going to say, don't talk about so much about what you do today. Go back and talk about entry-level job. What was your entry-level job going into banking? Because it probably wasn't, you know, high-level title. And connect with these students so that they can see that, oh, yeah, okay, so you don't go from, you know, 0 to 60 in 5 seconds. And your career path was probably not as linear as maybe we thought it would be when we were 20, right? So we're trying to expose them to a variety of job titles, companies, organizations, industries that many of our students have never heard of. And there are a lot of aha moments that will occur. And it's a win-win-win. It's a win for the alums. They love to come back to campus, talk about themselves. Let's just be honest. Second, it's a win for faculty who are hearing stories and learning things that they can then share in other classes, and the students make some real connections. So, you know, we have work to do. Most of your children, if you have them, they know what you do, maybe some relatives, some of their friends' parents. They don't have a clue about the wide gamut of options for them in their careers. And as we know, there are careers that exist today that weren't here 5 years ago. So we're trying to be on top of that. So I think we're about out of time, Michael. Am I hearing the hook, feeling the hook at my back? So yeah. So thank you to our panelists for today. This was very informative. Thank you. Awesome.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn and Michael and Shannon, and thanks all of you for showing up today. Just a couple of closing remarks. It's not lost on the staff that our last live event was November 30th, just as the Omicron variant was about to rocket into the stratosphere. And we're really hoping that this is the bookend of what we're dealing with. Of course, if you talk to Dr. Ambler for 5 minutes, she'll scare the crap out of you, but we're keeping our fingers crossed. And I do want to thank my staff, Amy and Jason and Melissa and Aurora and Kathy, for everything they do. They're here for all of you, so please don't hesitate to reach out to them. A couple of quick liner notes. We have some upcoming events. Amy's All Access Healthcare Series. She's hosting a webinar on the 7th of March featuring B. Grouse, who's the president of the Healthcare Association of New York State. April is Workforce Month. That's Jason's party, and that'll be a live workforce event. And May is Real Estate Month. We've just secured a keynote from the Brookings Institute, a senior fellow who's going to present her national research on statewide approaches to the housing crisis, and specifically where New York fits in. Spoiler alert, New York has a lot of work to do. So, thank you all for showing up this morning. Enjoy the rest of your day.